Welcome to Future Talk. On today's program, we're going to talk about whether social networking technology can advance the cause of peace. I have two guests, both of them from the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford University. Margarita Kiwis is the current director of the lab. She's also a social entrepreneur and mentor capitalist and former director of a technology incubator for women entrepreneurs. Mark Nelson is a co-founder of the Peace Innovation Lab and also the head of the EPIC Challenge project, which seeks to create an international network of researchers to find ways to increase positive interactions across conflict boundaries. The goal of the Peace Innovation Lab is to reduce the amount of violence in the world using social networking tools and other technologies. The lab is closely related to another organization at Stanford called the Persuasive Technology Lab, and we're going to talk about that as well. So Margarita, how exactly do you use social networking tools to advance the cause of peace?
So in 2009, we launched a project called Peace. And in that project, our goal was to see if we could work with organizations like Facebook and others that gather lots of social data and see with the interactions between people. So with peace.facebook.com, what we persuaded them to do was to look at all the friending activities across conflict boundaries. And what was significant about that was that we were able to see what people actually do versus what we think that they might do or what we might assume that we might do. So we were able to see the number of active daily friendships between, say, Israelis and Palestinians.
Now, how do you know in Facebook, do these people identify themselves on Facebook as being on one side of a conflict?
Yes. So we're looking at their profile data and how they self-identify, and then we can see when people friend each other. And so what Facebook was able to do is aggregate all that data on a daily basis. So they look at friending activity across geographic boundaries, political boundaries, and religious boundaries.
And what does it do with that data?
Right now it just presents it. And when people look at it, they're quite startled because they think, well, Israelis and Palestinians aren't friends at all. It's a historic conflict and they're never going to get along and they don't ever talk to each other. But then when they look at the data, they go, oh, people actually friend each other on a daily basis. And in fact, during the recent bombings from Gaza, Mark was observing some of the data that was going on, and he could speak to that.
Yeah, so what came out of that you would like to tell us?
Well, so the amount of engagement and friendship across that particular conflict boundary is remarkably resilient. And the first startling thing is it's way more than anybody thinks. And so the worst day in that war, 105 people, I believe, were killed or injured. On that same day, 16,000 and some people friended each other across that boundary. So we seldom see that context. You know, our brains and the media are focusing our context on the bad news.
Now, if you friend someone on Facebook, that doesn't mean you're really a friend, does it? It means you're connecting with them somehow.
That's right. It would mean that you've directed a certain amount of attention and awareness to that person. And so I wouldn't want to make any strong claims about how good that relationship is, but we can say some things about how bad it almost certainly isn't, because we know precisely what happened there was that somebody on one side of the boundary, a Palestinian, for example, publicly requested that an Israeli publicly acknowledge them as a friend, and that Israeli publicly did so. And those two people, we can infer, are probably not the ones shooting at each other.
So now what happens with this data? Can you get into some kind of cycle that the more people friend each other, that leads to still more people friending each other?
Well, one of the things that we've observed in one of the efforts that we're incubating and supporting on Facebook is a program called Israel Loves Iran. And Ronnie Edry, who's a graphic designer out of Tel Aviv, started this in May of last year, where he decided to put up a Facebook campaign saying, "We love you, Iran, we don't want to go to war with you." And what we've done as page administrators and observing the behavior of those people on it is that initially, you know, there was this communication, and between Israel and Iran, they actually have not had any formal communications for 3 decades. And so now what happened was that all of a sudden Israelis were making friends with Iranians. and then they were telling stories to each other, and then they were sharing experiences with each other. So in some ways, this friending behavior, just being able to surface it, is sort of like a gateway behavior to other cordial engagement behaviors.
Now, does this really affect the dynamics of the conflict? I mean, some of these conflicts are pretty deep.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So in the case of Israel Loves Iran, it has gone through a number of iterations. And one of them is the campaign to help influence the elections in Israel, and really getting people rallying around and saying, let's vote for peace. And in fact, in the elections that happened this week, it turned out that it didn't go far right. But in fact, the new government is going to have to build a coalition.
We're talking about January 2013, because
yes.
this show might be seen quite a bit
Right.
into the future.
Right. So we can't indicate causality, but certainly what it's done is it's surfaced the issue, and there's a dialogue. And when we look at the data for that campaign, it has an indirect reach of 20 million people. So people through their social graph, through sharing, through commenting, and so on, they've been able to virally propagate this idea that there should be interaction. And what's interesting about Israel Loves Iran is that it spawned other campaigns, like Israel Loves Palestine, Palestine Loves Israel, and there are about 30 other reciprocal sites. So now other countries where they have a conflict with an adjacent country are also launching similar campaigns, because they go like, wow, this is cool and it works and I like it and I can get people behind it. It's a very simple idea.
Now, I have a lot more questions to ask, but I think we have some slides which we're going to look at.
Sure.
So can we see the first slide, please? So there it is. So what are we looking at here? It says Hack for Egypt.
That's our good friend and colleague Dave Nielsen, who runs CloudCamp on the side and collaborates with us. And,
Is he at Stanford?
He's not. CloudCamp is a nonprofit organization that works with cloud computing around the world, and Dave is one of our collaborators. And he helped us put on a hackathon to build applications to help rebuild Egypt after the Arab Spring in 2010. So that's one example of applications of technology to help support activists.
Okay, so he was supporting the people who were rebelling against the Mubarak government?
Right.
This was post the fall of the Mubarak government, and so the question that we were addressing in that hackathon specifically is, turns out you can use technology to overthrow a government. We didn't know that was possible before. The big question, though, is how do you rebuild the country after that?
And how do you make sure that the new government is better than the previous one?
Right.
Right. And how do you help people do that transition from being told what to do to being able to take an active part in choosing what their country should do and so forth? And so we were doing things like, for example, helping to crowdsource the new Egyptian constitution, building apps to do that, for example, so that people could do a comparative analysis of what they liked about other constitutions around the world and say, we like that article, maybe we could import that into ours.
So it's largely crowdsourcing. Everybody's ideas are put in one central place where everybody can see what everybody else is thinking and talking about, and maybe they're able to use that to advance their own purposes.
That was one of the projects that came out of that hackathon, for example.
Okay, let's see the next slide if we could. Okay.
So this slide was the first image that Ronnie posted on Facebook for Israel Loves Iran. And this was came out of the political rhetoric that was going on in Israel about, this nuclear threat between Israel and Iran. And so Ronnie said, I'm a graphic designer, I object to this, how can I de-escalate it? And it's really interesting because it's an example of citizen diplomacy, and it's an example of citizen psyops. So when we talk to our colleagues in the military, they look at psychological operations and how do you persuade people and how do you move people. So in World War II, they might have dumped a lot of leaflets in a country to persuade people, or radio programs and things of that nature. Now what we see is that individuals can use a platform like Facebook, which is actually a platform for mass interpersonal persuasion, because you can reach millions of people all at once.
Now, who's it who's being persuaded? Because Iran has been pretty threatening toward Israel. They've repeatedly promised to wipe it off the map.
So the the interesting experiment here is that, again, it's part of this bottoms-up trend of individuals saying, well, instead of having this top-down hierarchical approach of individuals collectively coming together and say, like, well, maybe we can oppose this, or maybe we can shift public opinion on our own because we actually have these megaphones like Facebook. Whereas in previous decades, if you wanted to persuade people, you needed to own a media company, or you were a head of state, or you were head of a religion, and you couldn't reach the masses with your message that way. Now an individual like Ronnie can launch a Facebook campaign, touch 20 million people, and not spend a dime.
Well, it seems like the internet is a huge accelerant. It speeds up everything, maybe for both peace and war. It can also accelerate conflict.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Let's look at the next slide, if we could.
So this is a screenshot of a reciprocal site to Israel Loves Iran, and this is where the Iranians are reciprocating. So when Ronnie put up his page, within hours an Iranian put up a page saying, we don't want to go to war with you either. And it just speaks to how quickly people are able to respond.
So there are some grassroots activities.
Absolutely.
There are plenty of people in Iran and Israel who really don't want to go to war with each other, but there's still that small percentage that controls all the weaponry that looks like they're heading toward a showdown, perhaps. So it's interesting whether enough grassroots pressure can change the power dynamics in this equation. And
it remains to be seen. So we look at these efforts as prototypes, and people experimenting with the medium and seeing what the potential is. And again, with Facebook, one of the things that we find particularly interesting are all the insights. So for instance, on this campaign, we have access as page administrators, so we can look at all the data. So when Ronnie and his associates post something, we can see how much engagement there is. How many times is this image shared, commented on, reposted, viewed? We can look at the statistics based on country and city and demographics, men, women, breakdown in ages, and so on. So you have a really precise lens, so they can continue to experiment at no cost and just iterate until they find the method that works.
The right message, maybe.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's look at the next slide.
Now, this is a campaign called Romancing the Border, and this is...
I can't quite read the lettering on the shirts, but I think one of the shirts says Pakistan, and I think the other one says India.
That's right. So Romancing the Border is a program to reduce tension along the Pakistan-India border. And this was started by a college student, and his name is Rehman Ilyas. And so he started this slightly before Ronnie started his campaign between Israel and Iran. And actually the conflict between India and Pakistan in some ways is more tense. It's larger populations, and they're both nuclear powers.
Well, some conflicts are caused by very ambitious leaders, but I think some conflicts are also grassroots conflicts where there are two peoples like India and Pakistan. It doesn't just sound like it's megalomaniacal leaders. It sounds like these whole groups of people really see themselves as enemies of each other.
There are usually a lot of inputs into any one conflict, a lot of what we would call antecedents, and it's interesting to sort of separate those out and then design an intervention to target one of them. One of the things that Rehman realized is he went to university in Hong Kong, and suddenly, for the first time in his life as a Pakistani, was in the same class with a bunch of students from India, and suddenly realized, wow, as soon as we get outside of our context in our own countries, we're very like each other. We're great friends, and we gravitate towards each other. Why can't we be like that in the rest of the world? And so he, I think, wisely bit off a small slice of the big problem and said, maybe I can do something about student relationships, starting there, and so working with young people, which I think is probably a wise approach, because like most conflicts, they're tangled, they're complicated, there are a lot of issues, and anybody who wants to work on them should probably pick one part and get good at that one bit.
Okay, I think we have one more slide. Can we see that last slide, please? Right, so this is a group picture. Margarita, I think that's you in the center right with the blue sweater.
Right, yeah. This was taken a year ago. We were invited to present our work at the NATO PsyOps conference in Orlando. And it was fascinating to spend 3 days with these military officers who focus on psychological operations, and having a conversation with them about social media, because in some ways they're limited in what they can do. When I was at the Aspen Institute this summer for the first dialogue on technology and diplomacy, and sitting around with people like Madeleine Albright and others talking about what happened in the Arab Spring and why couldn't anyone predict it? So you have all this intelligence on the ground. Why didn't they see it coming? And part of it is because they weren't listening to where the conversation was really happening. They were, you were bureaucrats talking to bureaucrats. And if they had been hanging out sort of like at the local watering hole, what are youth talking about on Facebook, they might have had more of an inkling of what was going on.
I think there's also a lot of repressed anger in the world. People have been swallowing their anger maybe for centuries because they didn't really have a way to release it. And now things like Facebook kind of enable it to come to the surface, which may or may not be a healthy thing. Like if all these long repressed angers suddenly were released, would we be better off? Would that be a more peaceful world?
Well, the interesting thing about what happened in the Arab Spring was that collectively people realized that they had a shared grievance. And in Tunisia, I think the data on Facebook was that like something on the order of 80% of the population was on Facebook by the time it sparked. And it was this collective realization that everyone was unhappy. And prior to that, without having that access, they were going like, well, something feels wrong, but I think it's just me, and no one else feels this. And once they did, then they realized that they had the ability and the momentum to change it. But when we look at the aspirations of the people in the Middle East, the population is very young. Over half the population is under 35, and they are looking for a path to have a better life. And so places like Facebook allow them to express that. So I spend a lot of time looking at Facebook and what people do there. And I have a ton of Pakistani friends because of Romancing the Border, so they friend me and I connect with them because I'm curious to see what they care about. And their goals are like ours. They're aspirational. The things that they post are, friends, family, inspiration, all the things that we care about.
Well, if people want all these good things, what is really driving all the conflicts in the world? Because it's obvious that there's an enormous amount of momentum behind conflict, probably a lot more momentum than there is behind any possible peace efforts going on. And what do you think are the driving forces that keep the pot boiling in so many places all the time?
Actually, I think that assumption is incorrect when you look at the data. It turns out, and Steven Pinker at Harvard has done really great work on this to show that we're actually living at the most peaceful time in history by a long
Really? Because you look at places like Syria and other places?
Indeed, and that's the kind of stuff that makes the media. And what you don't see is all of the international trade, all of the mutually positive, mutually beneficial relations that are happening across all these different conflict boundaries. Nobody ever, again, is presenting the conflict in the context of and how much peaceful, mutually beneficial, positive, pro-social exchange is also going on.
Well, how do we actually define peace? Is peace merely the absence of violence, or is it something else? Because there are countries where internally they're at peace, but that doesn't mean that people don't live in fear.
Yeah.
They might be peaceful because they're afraid of what will happen to them if they do something unpeaceful.
Right. So I should first be very straightforward that there are a lot of good definitions of peace out there, and the definition that we use, we're not going to make any claim that it's the right definition or the best definition. We're just going to say it's the definition best suited to our tools. So we look at peace in terms of measurable positive engagement across a difference boundary of some kind. So we would look at culture or ethnicity or language or religion or any social difference that has typically and traditionally blown up into a violent conflict and say, can we use technology to elicit measurable, positive, pro-social, mutually beneficial behavior across that line? So we don't think of peace so much as, well, there are three categories actually that we look at. One is when there is conflict, can we measurably reduce it? That one's important, but we're not nearly as focused on that one now as we used to be. Because it turns out that that's largely remedial. That's largely about fixing things that are already broken. It's important work. A lot of other people doing good work in that space already. The next category above that is really interesting. Because getting people to reduce violence implies that peace is actually just people ignoring each other. And we don't think that's the case at all.
Now, do you think that peace is the default condition of mankind? The normal state is peace, and war is an aberration resulting mostly from understandings? I mean, some people would say that the normal condition of mankind is war because everybody wants to dominate their neighbor and not be dominated by them, and everybody covets things that they cannot get through peaceful methods. They can only get by taking them by force from somebody else. So which is the norm, really?
I'm not sure it's one or the other, but if you talk about percentages of time spent in either pro-social behavior or antisocial behavior, you're going to see that as a species we spend far more of our time in pro-social behavior because biologically we're this interesting aberration in terms of a life form. We don't have claws, we don't have fangs, we don't even have fur, and so most of our survival comes from the fact that we're a herd species. We have to work together to survive and to deal with the harshness of nature. So we're really wired to cooperate and collaborate in most cases.
Well, aren't human beings divided into separate segments, different groups, where people are pro-social within their group, but they're antisocial toward other groups?
Excellent point, excellent point. So we see that kind of behavior happen again and again, where you increase the positive pro-social behavior within a group, and that actually pushes the conflict out to the edge, and then when that group bumps up against another group that is identifiably different in some way, that's where the conflict is actually worse, and so all you've done is move it to an edge somewhere. There's more work in the world going on these days, and Steven Pinker at Harvard is again pushing this work, to actually just make the group bigger. What if we began thinking of ourselves as the human species and realize that our biggest enemies are probably viruses and bacteria and so on, rather than other humans? There's a lot of indications that that circle is slowly expanding as we become more aware of each other. And so one of the things we see with technologies like Facebook, for example, is increased awareness and people being able to give increased attention to, okay, now I see that my behavior over here actually affects somebody over there in ways that I had never known.
Now, is this sort of an ebb and flow where people might start to think of themselves as citizens of the world, but then back to their nation or their ethnic group or their religion? Because I think at any given time, people tend to identify with whatever group gives them the most power or the most advantages. And like a lot of people would say, identifying as a human doesn't give you much. That's not very cohesive. But a smaller group could be more cohesive.
Well, it's interesting because you're touching on the issue of identity. And one of the interesting times that we're in is that identity is becoming very fluid. So when we talk again to people in diplomacy or in defense, one of the things that they acknowledge is, what is a nation state now? Because we have these transnational communities. We have, for instance, I'm Mexican American, so there are more people who come from my mother's home state who live in Los Angeles than live in, her home state. And so when you have that kind of dynamic going on, then the question of being like, well, what does it mean to be an American, or what does it mean to be a Filipino when there's such a large expatriate population that live elsewhere? That challenges that notion. Especially
when it takes a lot of effort and maybe some sacrifice to keep that cohesion going.
Right.
And you have to decide, how much do I want to invest in these institutions?
So it puts into question institutions. It turns out that people start having multiple identities. So it may not be tied in real estate. Identity becomes a state of mind. We spent the day today at Facebook looking at their compassion research, and they're looking at affinity and how can they use affinity as a way to increase social cohesion within the social graph in Facebook. And they're just starting that kind of research and saying, like, what is it that they can surface, especially around conflict resolution on Facebook. And by bringing, the similarities that we have, how can we trigger compassion for each other, so that way when we are trying to resolve a conflict, we are more committed to resolving it peacefully.
Okay. We just have a few minutes left, and I said at the beginning that I wanted to talk a little bit about the Persuasive Technology Lab, which the Peace Innovation Lab grew out of, and which is still... So what was that about? It sounds a little manipulative, like you're going to persuade people to do something they might not want to do. How does that work? What's that all about? And how does that relate to what you do?
Okay, do you want to take that, Mark?
Sure.
Okay.
So Persuasive technology, we basically look at how does technology change human behavior. And underlying that, this is all built on the work of Dr. B.J. Fogg, I should be very clear about, and his work is built on the insights of people like Cliff Nass and Byron Reeves at Stanford, who noticed back in the 90s that we were giving our technology the same agency in our lives that we give to other people. And so BJ then started asking the question of, well, given that we're doing that, how can we make sure we're doing that in ways that help us become better people and help us do things we want to do, as opposed to having technology accidentally manipulate us to do things we don't want to do? So I can give you an example of accidental technological manipulation that caused people to do things they didn't want, and why we're trying to avoid that. The whole transition to smartphones, for example, we now see in the insurance data that if you own a smartphone, you're significantly more likely to be killed or injured in a car accident. That was one of the unintended outcomes of a technology that turns out to be very persuasive at diverting your attention.
Even if your hand's free?
Unfortunately, yes. So there are all sorts of interventions being built to try and solve that problem. The point being, technology does change our behavior. By the very act of us adopting it, our behavior changes. New technologies require new behaviors that then replace old behaviors in some ways. If we're not intentional about designing what those new behaviors are and making sure those new behaviors serve us, you can get accidental new behaviors that are very serious unintended consequences. So we look very carefully at what are the positive behaviors that we can.
Is there a consensus about what positive behaviors are? Because there could be a difference of opinion about what constitutes positive behavior.
Absolutely, and I was going to add on to Mark's comment that we're in an interesting time where there's a new group of people that have the ability to influence behavior at enormous scale, and it turns out to be software designers. Because software designers are, for the internet, they're trying to get people to do specific things. Or if you're an app designer, I'm trying to get you to do specific things.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at that, unfortunately, because I've just gotten the signal. So we are going to have to wrap it up. Yeah. I'd like to thank my two guests, Margarita Kiwis and Mark Nelson from the Stanford Peace Innovation Lab. Thank you for watching. Visit our website, www.futuretalk.net. For Future Talk, I'm Marty Wasserman. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for having us, Marty.
Thank you. Great job.
Great. Thank you.
The mics are off now. At least we think they are.
Okay. All right.
Sure about these things.